Dr. David Clark.
Mr. Speaker, in reference to the previous speaker, I rise actually to oppose this bill. The previous speaker made a number of unfounded allegations in her very short contribution, but it's fair to say added nothing of substance to this debate. The Public Finance Fiscal Responsibility Amendment Bill is a bill that paints by numbers fiscal responsibility. As I said in the committee stages of this debate, I strongly suspect it's an attempt by Treasury to rein in the current spending pattern of the government, an attempt to pull them back from this $300 million a week habit of borrowing with no real plan for the economy. Our economy is struggling, Mr. Speaker. It's not working for ordinary New Zealanders. Unemployment in my home region in Otago is at its highest level in 22 years. When last time the numbers were this bad, Ruth Richardson was the Finance Minister, and I think that is a sad indictment on the current government, who inherited zero net debt just 5 years ago, and in the meantime have driven our economy away from the responsible path it was on, and we now have the greatest gap between rich and poor. We have a growing government debt under this government. It is outrageous that they should suggest that this is something that is necessary for the Parliament in order to direct it on the right course. It is specifically the choices of this government that have put us in the wrong direction. This government is the one that passed those tax cuts in 2010 that saw 40% of the value go to the top 10% of earners. This government, 40% of the value went to the top 10% of earners. Outrageous. That's what it is. That's what it is. And the bottom 20% of earners got just 2% of the value of those tax cuts, Mr. Speaker. Just 2%. That is an outrage. So that is not responsible. In this legislation here we have reference to fairness. Well, if this bill will change the government's attitude to these issues, that will be a wonderful day. But I very much doubt it. I very much doubt it. If these are the guiding principles this government wants to put in place, and that's what it means by them, New Zealanders will be very, very, very suspicious about what this legislation will achieve. This legislation also talks about the likely impact on future generations in respect of government fiscal policy. Well, that's coming from a government that won't address the issue of superannuation and making our superannuation a sustainable scheme. Now, if there is no issue that is more important to New Zealanders in terms of their future well-being than whether they will be able to enjoy a retirement scheme that is sustainable. And this government has put its head in the sand on that issue. Now, the other crazy thing that was in this bill, and I am very glad it's been taken out, was something to do with the government's supply and confidence and supply agreement with John Bates. This bill originally, as it was originally drafted, promised a spending cap be implemented. Now, unfortunately, no one asked the independent MP, Mr Dunn, what he thought of that, and he, on this occasion, was very frank and described it as part of an unnecessary right-wing agenda and inconsistent with constitutional principles. National Act didn't have the numbers to pass it, but that's what they actually wanted in here. They wanted a spending cap, the same type of spending cap that you've seen in Colorado and California, and those examples should be instructive to New Zealanders. If we look across to Colorado and what happened there, Douglas Bruce, in fact, who was the most prominent advocate of a spending cap there, ended up in prison for tax avoidance. Now, that's a whole other story, but it tells you the kind of mindset that wants to push for this kind of legislation. It's the type that is mean-spirited, that doesn't have the wider public good in its frame, and that is all about making the numbers look good on paper. In Colorado, their infrastructure rotted. 48%, they are the 48th state in terms of education spending and the 44th in terms of road spending. They had previously been a proud state with good social infrastructure and with good physical infrastructure, and that all deteriorated. There's a whole economic literature on this bad experiment. I'm very glad on this occasion that Peter Dunn stood up to the others in this not corrupt, Mr Speaker, that would be a step too far, in this regime which has got a number of unsound ideas that it's trying to bring to this Parliament. I'm very glad that on this occasion Mr Dunn labelled it for what it was, part of an unnecessary right-wing agenda and inconsistent with constitutional principles. It came out, but that was what was sitting behind this in the National Government's mind. They wanted to bring in legislation that would reduce and restrict the options of future governments. Now, if we had such a fiscal cap in place, we would not have been able to make the Canterbury earthquake response that we made as a parliament. And I ask New Zealanders to think about that. That is the kind of short-term thinking this government wants to bring to this parliament. It wants to restrict future governments from dealing with crises. It wants to restrict future governments that find themselves in a tight spot from helping out the citizens of this country. Fortunately, that part of the legislation fell over, but it speaks to the intent of this government. This is hollow legislation. It's thin legislation. It describes motherhood and apple pie. It describes what responsible governments have done over the ages, and we can see that New Zealand governments have done different things. We know that the Labour government in the 80s brought spending under control. To some extent, the 90s with National continued that pattern. The 2000s, we had an exemplary government which brought government debt down to zero, net government debt down to zero, running 9 years of surpluses in a row. How many surpluses has this government generated? Mr. Bennett across the floor. Australia, how many, the member asked? Zero. None, Mr. Speaker. This government has not generated one government surplus in its entire time in this parliament. And yet, all we hear from them is about responsible financial management. Responsible financial management. Well, this is a government that knows how to talk responsible financial management, but does not know how to put it in place. Mr. Bennett says, come on. Well, the facts speak for themselves. The rhetoric does not stack up. This is an irresponsible government. It's passing this legislation, which it did not get bilateral agreement on, bipartisan agreement on. It failed to consult properly with the opposition to get to an agreed position. In this area, historically, there has been an agreement across the House. It has been the effort of past governments to make sure that everyone gets to have their say, because the whole point of this legislation is that you have a long-term plan for the country. Now, we think there should be a reference to adequate levels of national savings in this document. Silence from across the floor. Over there, they don't believe in an adequate level of national savings because it's not in the interests of the big end of town. That's whose interests they are looking out for. They don't address issues like a capital gains tax, which would be about a fair tax system, about pro-growth tax reform. They don't address issues about universal KiwiSaver. They're not interested in making sure New Zealanders are well prepared in their retirement. They're all more interested in driving down wages and making sure the interests of the 1% are looked after. They don't address monetary policy issues. They're still committed to the hands-off policies of the 80s. They do not want to update fiscal policy. They do not want to update financial policies. They are a hands-off government. They're not addressing the housing issue. They're not addressing the affordability of power issue. They are not addressing the big issues. This government has its head in the sand, and Mr. Speaker, that is why we oppose this bill. It doesn't address the big issues. It's a lot of piffle, waffle and empty words. It's tinkering, and it is not a bill worthy of this Parliament's time, and therefore, Mr. Speaker, Labour will oppose this bill through the rest of its time in the House.
I call John Hayes.
Thank you, Speaker.